This is the presentation for applying organizational culture to organizational behavior at work. So going back over the culture, there are the results of the interviews that we did with the staff, and we can see the results here. Now we're using a Weisbord model for the interviews, which left us with 6 categories. We've got leadership, purpose, relationships, how the work was structured, the incentives or other rewards, and then the helpful mechanisms and coordinating systems. Now what I found was there was no real alignment on purpose, and it was interesting when you talk to the people about the organization and what the purpose is to get different answers. And that led me to believe that the people were seeing the organization from a different point of view, and there really isn't a strong shared vision or value around what should be happening in the organization. Now we found there's no one really keeping the boxes balanced as far as leadership goes. So the answers around leadership were kind of all over the place. It seemed there really wasn't a centralized leadership position that everyone can agree upon. As far as structure, some people think the work is structured in an unfair way, and that there were certain members not pulling their weight. I really didn't get to the bottom of what was going on with that, but it seemed that people felt like people were not doing as much as other people in the organization. Now the relationships were said to be ineffective, and there were dynamics in the environment regarding the relationships that extend beyond the organizational environment and into personal territory, but that also affects business relationships. Now, as far as rewards, some people thought that the work was not being incentivized, and it's interesting. I mean, as far as compensation goes, people are being compensated along industry standards, but after doing a little bit more digging, I started to understand that the idea of unfair incentives comes more as far as references to other people inside the organization. We'll talk about that. About the best category that we got was for coordinating systems, and I think that was because, they're few and far between, and the ones that exist function well. Now, as far as the organizational culture, it seems that the culture is very individual in orientation. It's not very interdependent. It seems, especially from the lack of unified purpose, that people can accomplish their tasks without being highly integrated and coordinated with the rest of the people that are in the group. As far as power distance goes, it seems like there's a low power distance. So what I was able to gather from the interviews, there's a lot of expert power and a lot of referent power at play. So people that are well liked are able to claim power. People who at least talk a good game about knowing what to do next are able to wield power. The one thing that seems to be missing in terms of the power relationship is the acceptance of responsibility. So it seems that people can push further away without being responsible for the outcomes. As far as certainty, it seems like around relationships, there needs to be a lot of certainty. And in terms of performance, there's a high tolerance for ambiguity. And I don't exactly know how to talk about that in terms of the Hofstede model, but that's just what I was able to gather. In terms of achievement, there's a lot of talk about, just a lot of language about efficiency and achievement and progress, but it seems to be a lot of lip service when it comes to the structure of the organization and certain people not pulling their weight. It seems that there's more of a quality of life orientation, especially since some of the relationships support keeping the status quo. And in terms of time orientation, it seems like many decisions are made with a short-term orientation. It was something that when talking about the organization's purpose became evident. It seemed like each person was responding as though the purpose had to do with their short-term tasks and outlook. It didn't seem like there was a long-term vision in the organization. In terms of indulgence, it seems like the organization is more indulgence-oriented in the sense that as long as there is a good well-being for the members of the group, little attention is paid to other things. And when things are going well, it seems like much is forgiven with a lot of tolerance. Now, going forward, I was looking specifically at a couple of different behaviors. So what I was looking at were commitment, motivation, and stress. Now, as far as commitment, there are 3 different kinds of commitment. There's effective commitment, continuance commitment, and normative commitment. Effective commitment is staying because you want to. This could be because you like what you do with your job, or you like the organization, or what the organization stands for. And effective commitment is really about internally motivated positive association with what you're doing. Continuance commitment is staying because you need to, and that's more about needing your job, needing the paycheck, needing the recognition, needing the experience or time on the job. With continuance commitment, you have a need-based commitment, something that you're getting out of it. And normative commitment is staying because you ought to stay. This has to do with things like duty, maybe they paid for your degree, or maybe you're staying to pay them back. Maybe they took a chance on you when you had little experience, and now that you're more experienced, you're sticking around to help them out. Well, some of the people that are viewed as not pulling their weight, the perception is that they're only with the organization because they need to be. The perception is that the organization is compensating them above their performance, and they're not effectively committed to the organization or to the other members of the organization. And from that standpoint, it can hurt the underlying trust of the team, because they feel like any citizenship behaviors or any good things they do will not be returned or reciprocated, and may even be taken from the organization if that person leaves. Another thing as far as commitment is just psychological withdrawal. And one thing that I saw here is just looking busy. The perception is that when people aren't pulling their weight, they're masking that with a level of expertise, talking about and around certain things, and making suggestions, making it appear that the time they're spending not performing is spent doing research, making suggestions about what to do, rather than actually doing it and taking responsibility for it. And another thing would be doing the work and doing the research, but the work that you're doing is more valuable to the person personally rather than to the organization as far as organizational performance. Now, in keeping with this theme, we'll talk about motivation. Now, motivation is defined as a set of energetic forces that originates both within and outside an employee, that initiates work-related effort and determines its direction, intensity, and persistence. Now, equity theory acknowledges that motivation doesn't just depend on your own beliefs and circumstances, but also what happens to other people. And more specifically, equity theory suggests that employees create a mental ledger of the outcomes or rewards they get from their job duties. Now, if your ratio of outcomes outcomes to inputs is less than your comparison to somebody else, according to equity theory, any imbalance in the ratios triggers equity distress, which is an internal tension that can only be alleviated by restoring balance to the ratios. And so if you feel like someone else is doing less than you're doing, the equity distress likely takes the form of negative emotions such as anger or envy. And one way to stop those feelings or those emotions is trying to restore balance in some way. And so you could be constructive and proactive by talking to your boss and explaining why you deserve better outcomes, and trying to affect their situation. The other way would be trying to balance the scales by pulling back and putting in less inputs and outcomes for yourself to create some kind of parity. So if people feeling like certain members are not pulling their weight, and that's okay, it can easily disrupt motivation, not just for one person, but for the entire team. What's important to remember is that just because the perception is that people aren't pulling their weight, it doesn't mean it's actually the case. Although the perception of reality will bring about the response as though it's reality, so the behaviors are still going to be there just because of the perception, whether it's true or not. And the third behavior category to look at is stress. Now, stress is defined as a psychological response to demands that possess certain stakes for the person and that tax or exceed that person's capacity or resources. The demands that cause people to experience stress are called stressors. The negative consequences that occur when demands tax or exceed that person's capacity or resources are called strains. Now, there are two types of stressors. There are challenge stressors and hindrance stressors. And hindrance stressors are stressful situations and demands that people tend to perceive as hindering their progress toward a personal accomplishment or goal. And hindrance stressors most often trigger negative emotions like anxiety or anger. Challenge stresses, on the other hand, are stressful demands that people tend to perceive as opportunities for learning and growth and achievement. Although challenge stressors can be exhausting, they often trigger positive emotions such as pride and enthusiasm. So one type of work-related hindrance stressor is role conflict. And that refers to conflicting expectations that other people may have of us. So an example of role conflict would be incompatible demands within a single role that a person may hold. And in this organization, this can show up in a sense that people assume leadership positions and at the same time have other roles and responsibilities as well. Remember, we had that whole ambiguity about the leadership situation. So role ambiguity also is here, and it refers to a lack of information about what needs to be done in a role, or is unpredictability regarding the consequences or performance in that role. And in this organization, members are sometimes asked to work on projects for which they're given very few instructions or guidelines about how things are supposed to be done. And they could find themselves, again, leading or being in a position where people assume they're leading, and they don't know what needs to be done as a leader in that role. And there's also unpredictability about whether or not, if they make a suggestion, and that suggestion is being adopted, whether they're the ones leading it. So there's just a few things that in this organization, I mean, there were many other behaviors, and there are many causes of it. Some of them are organizational and, have to do with the structure and the systems that are in place. Some of them have to do with relationships and teams, and team building. I mean, there are a lot of different causes, but these are just the behaviors that I was able to see and how they shape up. And now here are some references.